Whilst the Adeptus Astartes as a whole are viewed with a healthy mix of adoration and fear by those who have encountered them, some have an overall much darker reputation. Names such as the Flesh Tearers, the Minotaurs, perhaps even bigger names like the Iron Hands should not be a source of inspiration for the citizens of the Imperium should they run across them. However, though one chapter is perhaps a bit of an unknown, their history and reputation is already rather terrifying. Hailing from shadowy origins and based seemingly above the galactic plane, they emerged most recently to cut a bloody swathe through enemy territory and then retreat again. None truly know their task nor their founder or actions for the most part, so as is common for those mysterious chapters, speculation has spread like a hushed wildfire amongst those intrigued. Regardless of who they are or where they came from, they are led, we think, by an individual named Tiberos the Red Wake, and they are known by several names. In Low Gothic, they are the Space Sharks. In High Gothic, they are the Carcharodon Astra, but most often they are simply known as the Carcharodons. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. Though records are incredibly fragmented, it would appear that the Carcharodon Astra have been around for an awfully long time. In fact, their first known appearance came all the way back in M32, making them something of a long-serving stalwart even if they don't have much evidence of acting like it. However, we do not officially know their founding, nor do we have any solid evidence as to their primogenitor legion. They could be from any founding officially up to the 8th, but more likely up to the 5th or so. At a cursory glance, their heraldry and name would give nothing away as to a potential Primarch for the Carcharodons, but looking a little deeper, a frontrunner or maybe two can be established. Their gene seed is rather unstable and degenerate, and can cause pallid skin and black eyes, a trait most commonly associated with the Raven Guard and Corvus Corax, whilst the title of Shade Lord, used by their commanders, was known only to be used by one individual, Arcus Phal, a Terran-born member of the Raven Guard Legion before the discovery of Corax, later exiled during the reorganization/purging of the 19th Legion in the Great Crusade. As Phal's fate is unknown following this exile, some speculate that he would go on to found the Carcharodon Astra, becoming known as the Forgotten One, the name assigned to the original chapter master. Speaking of the Terran-born Raven Guard, the renegades known as the Ashen Claws we've discussed in the past cannot be discounted either, especially as their strategies seem to align somewhat with the chapter of today. Whilst this theory under either form can certainly hold water, there is another, darker line of thinking, that the Carcharodons are instead descended from none other than the Night Haunter Conrad Kurz. The evidence here is more linked with their battle doctrine and armaments, which involve rather brutal close assault using typically lightning claws and chain glaives, both signature weapons of the former 8th Legion. In fact, even the traitor elements of the Night Lords themselves note an eerie similarity between their fighting styles, which should say a heck of a lot. As for a leader in this hypothetical, many would point toward the mysteriously vanished Jago Sevatarian, better known as Sevatar. I personally am unsure of this, as Sevatar was one of the most all-in of the traitors, even coining the now iconic Death to the False Emperor before Istvan V. But some do believe, or at least suspect, that the Forgotten One has that title simply because who he was would be too dangerous to their sons to be known. Regardless of their genetics, the Carcharodon Astra have gone on to prosecute their founders and the Emperor's will for the duration of their service to the Imperium, and I doubt they're altogether fussed about who they came from, if I'm honest. In fact, given their reputation and the fear it undoubtedly inspires, part of me suspects they'd, assuming it didn't lead to their destruction, welcome being scions of the Night Haunter in some way. The Carcharodons certainly do have a reputation, and as with the Minotaurs we discussed recently, it is a dark one in its own way. The chapter are renowned for their close assault and particularly their brutality in said assaults. However, it is not thought, at least not with all of them, that rage drives this brutality. Rather, it can be cold, calculated, and altogether 1,000 times more terrifying as a result. After all, a berserker murder machine is one thing, a fully sane and calculating killer is another thing entirely. They plan their attacks with detailed reconnaissance, often utilizing their scout company to full effect, but they are not renowned for extreme patience to the point of being unwilling to engage. Instead, the Carcharodons will make smaller, if not insignificant, strikes at their enemy's defences, testing it for resistance without risking themselves and also gauging enemy response times. If they can find or otherwise expose a workable breach in the defences, it is at that point that larger forces will be committed to the fight, swiftly wrapping up the engagement if at all possible with their brutality and also the element of surprise or shock and awe. They will then leave often as swiftly as they came once the war has ended. They do not seem to be builders or holders of territory, nor can I say for sure that they are conquerors either. Rather, once they have what they need, which may involve some ransacking, they will simply be on their way, retreating to wherever they base themselves or simply just moving on to the next war zone. As to whether they answer to any save themselves in terms of where they go, none can truly say. We certainly do not believe any external organisation has any control over them, which may mean they simply monitor for distress signals nearby, or that they go where they want for reasons known only to them. In this new era, the whereabouts and actions of the Carcharodon Astra are unknown since the appearance of the Cicatrix Maledictum and the return of Robert Gilliman. Perhaps this is no surprise, as quite frankly we know so little of the Carcharodons in general, but I don't doubt they're still active even if they are yet to receive Primaris reinforcement from the returned Primarch. In fact, I wouldn't even be surprised if he hasn't even run across them yet. The organisation of the Carcharodon Astra seems to follow the Codex Astartes as far as we know for the most part. If we assume their origin story to be the ones we theorised earlier, this may be something of a surprise, but it would make sense if they didn't wish to draw attention to themselves, or of course they may have been founded in the typical way, so following the Codex would just be logical. However, though we have not seen them deployed in full chapter strength to my knowledge, observers have noticed a couple of interesting quirks. It seems that, alongside the typical company structure of the Codex, the Carcharodons will supplement their deployments with scout and or Terminator elements alongside additional close assault squads. The former is obvious due to their reconnaissance etc., as do the Terminator forces known as Red Brethren, as they would make ideal line breakers that could be swiftly deployed by teleportation. The close assault units, known commonly as Devourers, are also a good fit for typical Carcharodon strategy, but whether they are from one of the reserve assault companies, such as the 8th, or they're truly in addition to the battle companies outside of the typical Codex structure, we are less sure. We also know that their Librarius follows the standard protocols, and that Librarians of the Carcharodons are capable of manifesting some rather unique psychic abilities not seen elsewhere. Perhaps this is an indication of their power, but also of their uniqueness. As an aside, their stance on the Emperor's divinity and such is mixed as well. Many chapters from Unknown Origins do venerate the Emperor, perhaps even seeing him as a god, but we are unsure whether this applies to any or all of the Carcharodon Astra, who seem to do their own thing, for want of a better word. As for home, well, there's kind of two answers for that. The Carcharodon Astra have no homeworld, that much is known. They instead operate as a fleet-based chapter, with their flagship potentially being the battle barge Nicor. However, it is thought that their fleet has a very different configuration designed around being beyond the Imperium for an extended period of time. This means that, most likely, they don't operate even close to the Imperium, as paying a flying visit to a local forge world for resupply or recruitment seems off the table. It is instead believed that the Carcharodons operate above the galactic plane, in the dark void there that is incredibly sparsely populated, I suspect. Yes, through the powers of science, many galaxies, including this one, are pretty much disks. The more you know. Why they'd be out there willingly is anyone's guess, aside from keeping themselves safe perhaps, since the warp can handle their travel needs and most people aren't going to go there. But they likely didn't have that much of a choice to go there. It is said that someone, probably the Forgotten One, but perhaps someone else, tasked the Carcharodons with hunting down the enemies of the Imperium from beyond its borders, which would explain why they're so far flung in terms of any base of operations they may have out there. Perhaps because of their extended isolation in what is known as the Outer Dark, the equipment of the Carcharodons is rather varied and almost hodgepodge in nature. Their power armour is quite often older models and marks than would be typical, with the infamous Mark V Heresy armour being especially prevalent. Not only does this make sense logistically, as Mark V was always something of a mishmash to the point it became a unique mark, but it also lends credence to the theories of their origins because they had to get those suits from somewhere, didn't they? Even their Terminator armor has seen what appears to be a lot of on-the-fly repairs or modifications, which also makes sense given the lack of time they likely spend in Imperial space to get proper suits or to get them officially patched up. Finally, for equipment, their vehicles are certainly not a point of renown. They have plenty of them, maybe it's not as much as other chapters, but certainly not so few as to be going without. That isn't the point. For reasons unknown, the Carcharodon Astra heavily favour infantry-based tactics in battle, despite the speed advantage that vehicles would obviously give them. This may be due to infantry being more stealthy if not deployed by drop pod. It may be a case of resource conservation since they don't get to go to Forge Worlds etc. often, or it may just be simple preference from the old days. Perhaps one could argue their use of hit-and-run tactics feeds into resource conservation too. I doubt the Outer Dark has many prime recruiting worlds out there, and Gene Seed must be treated as a premium resource, as getting new stock would be extremely difficult if lost in battle. Though we know how they recruit, we're not 100% where from. It may be that they just take from every warzone they go to, there may be the odd world dotted about that they take from. We're not 100% sure. I can come up with no better theory. As a second aside, the chapter is said to be frequent users of cryopods, though the reasons why are actually unknown. Perhaps it just helps to pass the time if you're out in the dark for so long. This means that, potentially, in fact certainly, there are some truly ancient Carcharodons, and it probably raises some very interesting questions since maybe, just maybe, some of their original members, or those who knew them, will still be alive today. Maybe. As mentioned previously, the records of the Carcharodon Astra are fragmented at best, but we do know of a few battles that they've fought in down the years. The earliest are a pair of wars back in M32, the Solar Rebellion and the Astropath Wars. Sadly, we know nothing of the latter of these two other than a date and the presence of the Carcharodons in it, but the former we recently mentioned with the Minotaurs. With the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, World Eaters and more all involved, this series of uprising by chaos cults to the west of Segmentum Solar had the potential to be devastating. However, despite heavy losses, the Loyalists were victorious, though the role played by the Carcharodons and everybody else is sadly unknown. They then actually showed up again not much later, gathered at the behest of the High Lords of Terror in late M33. Along with the Flesh Eaters, Red Talons, Charnel Guard and Death Eagles, who have their own intriguing origin story just for the record, they formed the Pentarchy of Blood, convened during an event known as the War of the False Primarch. Exactly why such a war broke out has been lost to history, though obviously it had something to do with a false Primarch that potentially 11 chapters decided to believe was a real one. Like I say, lost to history, kinda guessing. Whatever the details, the Senatorium Imperialis declared said 11 chapters as traitores perdita, effectively traitors and renegades, and the Pentarchy of Blood were dispatched to deal with them. Why they were sent at a deficit of 2-1, I don't know, but there you go. Admittedly, by that time the war had ground on for the best part of a century, so the freshly deployed Pentarchy were more than enough to close it out and bring peace to the swathes of Segmentum Pacificus that had been plunged into anarchy by the conflict. Again, sadly, we don't know what role the Carcharodon Astra played in the actual war, nor do we know their opponents since their names will have been scrubbed from the Imperial history we usually have to go on for these things. But I don't doubt they had more than a small part to play in the battles. It is at this point that we find ourselves with a massive hole in history, as the next recorded appearance of the Carcharodons wasn't until M37 and the 7th Black Crusade. Their role in this conflict that almost saw the Blood Angels wiped out might be small at a glance, but potentially was a massive contribution. After the Blood Angels and their allies the Rampagers lost badly to the forces of Abaddon, with the entirety of the Sons of Sanguinius being present on the planet Macan and thus threatened with potential annihilation by the Despoiler, the Carcharodons fell upon the Black Legion fleet during the attempted rout. It is unclear what difference it made, but it may well have been enough to stop the Blood Angels from being wiped out, so credit where credit is very much likely due. There's then another large history gap with a brief interlude involving an explorative fleet and an orc ship, But the main conflict the Carcharodon Astra are renowned for is without a doubt the Badab War. Their entry was not requested by the Senatorum Imperialis, or if it was, the other loyalist forces were certainly not told about it. The Carcharodons appeared out of nowhere near the Golgothan Wastes in 910 M41 toward the end of the war, to the alarm and concern of both Imperials and the secessionists under who would become Huron Blackheart. They then pledged themselves to the Imperium's side just to make sure things were clear, and though the coalition's commander was incredibly not on board, he did give them a task. Said task saw them deployed to the Endymion cluster, I believe, in the north of the war zone, engaging the bases of the Mantis warriors who were part of the secessionist forces and to whom the inhabitants of the cluster still owed some loyalty. The approach of the Carcharodons to the Endymion cluster was, well, brutal as all hell if I'm being completely honest. Rather than surgical strikes against bases or hit-and-run raids as typical doctrine might suggest, the chapter adopted what is known as a scorched earth policy. Untold numbers of humans were slain, many of them likely innocent, and entire worlds were razed, perhaps beyond salvation, in a horrific terror campaign. Why go down this route though, especially against secessionists who could potentially be brought back into the Imperium once the war was over? Simple. Honour. The Mantis warriors, for all the faults they may have had, were an honourable bunch, and they would not stand for the people of the Endymion cluster being slaughtered. In short, they were all but forced, baited out, to confront the Carcharodons head on. Unfortunately for them, this was exactly what the Loyalists wanted. By whittling down the numbers of the Mantis warriors in a series of brutal assaults, the Carcharodons forced the secessionists to surrender and ultimately withdraw from the war entirely. Admittedly, the methods employed by the Carcharodon Astra were so repulsive as to potentially play a part in the withdrawal of the Loyalist Fire Angels from the war in turn, but I doubt the Space Sharks cared one jot since they got the job done and the Fire Angels were already low on numbers. Eventually, the time came to assault the Palace of Thorns on Badab Primaris itself. The Carcharodons were not tasked with the overall assault, as that fell primarily to the Star Phantoms, but they were instead tasked by Lord Commander Kuln with damaging the infrastructure of the planet to prevent a good defense. They did this on the second day of the assault, having concocted a plan that would likely have filled most Astartes with utter disgust, but damn was it going to work. They slaughtered their way through the secessionists in their way before sabotaging the geothermal power plants deep underground. This caused the hives to literally collapse in tectonic catastrophe, eventually leading to pretty much the death of Badab Primaris itself in toxic fallout. And though the Loyalists were able to push the opening and ultimately win, almost slaying Huron, countless Star Phantoms were unable to escape the Armageddon unfolding around them, or were shot down in their flight by whatever means necessary, including in traitor ships. Unsurprisingly, the Star Phantoms were not impressed with their actions of their allies, who likely didn't even tell them the plan, and though I doubt there will ever be a mission-threatening blow-up if they cross paths again, I expect the survivors will view the Carcharodons with anger and contempt with the rest of their days. For their part, they'd already withdrawn in good order before all hell broke loose, so probably they just saw it as a job well done all round, even by their uncompromising standards. However, even the cleansing of the Endymion cluster and the near annihilation of Badab Primaris wasn't quite enough destruction for the Carcharodon Astra, apparently. Alongside the Fire Angels, who I guess had put their differences over their methods aside, the Carcharodons returned to the Endymion cluster and aided in the return to compliance of whatever they had murdered the first time. The Fire Angels were given dominion over the cluster, and they granted the final request of the Space Sharks. The Carcharodons travelled to Tranquility, the system in which the Mantis warriors had once been based, and looted the fortresses of the now pardoned secessionists who were likely on penitent crusade at the time, and thus didn't own the fortresses anymore. Just for the record, it's not actually stealing, it's more spoils of war. Not only did the Carcharodons make off with vast amounts of material for their own use, they also took pretty much an entire generation of people to compete for the right to join their now depleted ranks. Truly, word of advice, don't mess with the Carcharodon Astra. Whilst we do not know their full command structure, a few members of the Carcharodon Astra have become rather famous, though really infamous is definitely the better word. First and foremost in this is the individual believed to be their chapter master, certainly their commander during the Badab War at any rate. This individual is commander of the Red Brethren, the Terminator armoured elite from the First Company, so he's going to be first captain if he isn't chapter master, and his name is simply Tyberos, the Red Wake. Tyberos was effectively the ambassador to the Loyalist forces in the Badab War, being perhaps the only liaison between the Carcharodons and everyone else in its prosecution. He seemed to be a man of not many words, and those words he did speak were not loud and bullish as you might expect from such an overtly brutal chapter. Instead, like both legions he may have been sired from, he is much more quietly spoken, almost whispering everything he said. And yet that didn't make him any less terrifying, as those whispers always carried the impending threat of death upon them. It is little wonder that Lord Commander Kuln has such concerns about the Carcharodons with an ambassador like that. Add that to his pallid skin with bones exposed, and the fact he never left his Terminator armour, and you have one nightmare of an individual even before he steps on the battlefield. And once he does, hope you're not against him. His aforementioned armour is armed with a pair of lightning claws known as Hunger and Slake, a design unknown to the Adeptus Mechanicus and thus either unique or forgotten in terms of design. Perhaps he just inherited it, who knows. Those who have faced Tyberos say he is lightning fast, almost too fast to follow with the naked eye, and that all that remains after his passing is just a pile of corpses. But it is, as suggested by his voice, not maddening rage that creates this pile of corpses, rather it is much more calculated. Every kill is made with precision, as if it was planned before it happened, which if true, speaks volumes to the abilities of the Red Wake as a warrior and as a mind. Annoyingly, we don't know exactly what he got up to in the Badab War besides just murdering a bunch of secessionists. I don't doubt he was all over the Endymion cluster as well as on Badab Primaris, but whether he did anything of particular note is unknown to us, unfortunately. Perhaps even more frustratingly though, the rest of the Carcharodon Astra have even less known about them. They are even more enigmatic than their first captain, chapter master, whatever Tyberos actually is exactly. Seriously, we know almost nothing about them, much to my chagrin. However, we do at least have a name for their chief librarian, the Pale Nomad, Te Kahurangi. We do not know when Kahurangi ascended to the office of chief librarian, nor where he came from initially, but it is known that he is old. Very old. Some say he is the oldest of the Carcharodon Astra not entombed within a dreadnought, only perhaps 3 generations removed from the original founders of the chapter. Given the use of cryopods we mentioned earlier in combination with the Susan membrane, this is certainly not impossible, but of course we'll likely not get proof either way, but if we could, I'd really like to interview him about that. Incidentally, the original Carcharodons who founded the chapter are known within the chapter itself as the Wandering Ancestors. This makes a measure of sense given the task they are said to have been assigned, but it doesn't help with deciphering their origins one bit. If the Librarius is a bit of an unknown, then other specialists are a total mystery. Though as usual we lack confirmation, it is believed that apothecaries and tech marines of the chapter almost never leave their fleet. In a sense this is logical, as they are perhaps amongst the hardest individuals in the chapter to replace, especially tech marines who are of course trained by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The final individual I know enough about to discuss would be Kahu, a veteran of the First Company known as a strike leader. Though you might expect to find him alongside Tyberos, who of course was his company's commander, Kahu was something of an enforcer for the Red Wake and was often deployed alongside various other battle companies. Though they didn't speak of it openly, many other leaders of the Carcharodons knew that having Kahu assigned to you was not so much a sign of favour as an indicator of the importance of the task at hand and a way of keeping you on task. Such was his position during the deployment of the Third Company to the prison world of Zartak, as part of what is known as the Red Tithe, essentially the name of the recruitment operation undertaken by the Carcharodons, also done in the Endymion cluster after the Badab War. Basically, gather up a bunch of people, let them kill each other until you have a series of recruits. Unfortunately, this operation didn't go as smoothly as the one in Endymion, as Zartak was being raided at the time by none other than the Night Lord's Traitor Legion, who had been told of the coming of their lost brothers by a demon in advance of the Carcharodons' coming. Symbolism / hinting much? I think so. Maybe. Possibly. Suffice it to say that an incredibly bloody battle ensued, in which I don't doubt Carhu was living up to his other reputation, that of being relentless and savage on the battlefield, made all the more disturbing by the fact that neither ally nor enemy will hear the Carcharodons speak whilst this murder goes on. They communicate with each other, but there are no war cries, no talking with their allies. It is all done, to the outside viewer, in total silence. Unfortunately, this would also be the last battle that Carhu would take part in, as he and 3 other members of the First Company joined the Third on Zartak, perhaps all of them present in fact, were slain in a Night Lord's ambush. To be fair, there were a lot of Carcharodons killed in this manner. It's kind of the Night Lord's way, though I suspect the traitors will have paid rather heavily for every Carcharodon that fell. So end the tales of the Carcharodon Astra. In truth, I wish we knew more about the mysterious space sharks, though perhaps it is better we don't know given their savage nature. Oh, who am I kidding? There are so many questions I want to have answered. Who did they come from? When did they come from? Where did they come from? What does their command structure look like? The list goes on and on. I doubt we'll get these answers, but just the information we have on them up to now is both insightful and somewhat unnerving at the same time. And if I go above the galaxy or beyond its edge, I certainly don't fancy running across them. For now, though, we must, of course, move on. It's been a while since we got to look at a non-human group that wasn't one of those sneaky Eldari, so let's redress the balance somewhat and look once more at the least subtle of them. That is for the future, though, and for now, it is adieu. Thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.